From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I think if we look at something as important to all of us as health care, we can see that now the Trump administration is carrying forth the Koch donor network's agenda, and it's a perfect microcosm of what I try to get at the book, because because it shows us that the donor network is driving the Republican Party rather than its own constituents.
As Republicans attempt to revive a highly unpopular bill to overturn Obamacare, we look at the right's attempt to reshape the role of the federal government, from health care to education to housing, with Duke University historian Nancy McLean, author of the new book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. McLean also uncovers the instrumental role the late libertarian economist James Buchanan played in the right's campaign to eliminate unions, suppress voting, and privatize schools.
James Buchanan was an economist who trained at the University of Chicago and then went on to a number of Virginia institutions over the years. He won the Nobel Prize in 1986 for his very original contributions to our understanding of political economy. And it was James Buchanan who taught Charles Koch that for capitalism to thrive, democracy must be enchained.
Then President Trump says the Environmental Protection Agency will roll back an Obama policy environmentalists say safeguards drinking water for 1 in 3 Americans.
EPA's so-called Waters of the United States rule is one of the worst examples of federal regulation, and it has truly run amok.
This comes as The Intercept reports the person Trump has tapped to be the EPA's water safety official is a former lobbyist with deep ties to a fossil fuel advocacy group that promotes the Dakota Access Pipeline and offshore drilling. We'll speak with investigative reporter Lee Fong. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Republican leaders scrambled Wednesday to rescue a Senate plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act after at least 9 Republican senators said they could not support their party's bill. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said he hoped to finish a revised bill by Friday and would submit it to the Congressional Budget Office for review ahead of plans to take up the measure after a week-long recess for the 4th of July. McConnell abandoned a push for a vote this week after some Republicans balked over the CBO's finding that the Senate bill would cause 22 million Americans to lose their health insurance over the next decade. At the White House, President Trump predicted the Senate would still pass a repeal of Obamacare.
Health care is working along very well. We could have a big surprise with a great health care package, so now they're happy.
What do you mean by big surprise, sir?
I think you're going to have a great surprise. It's going to be great.
Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, demonstrators flooded the offices of several Republican senators Wednesday in what they called a last stand to prevent a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. At a sit-in protest at the offices of Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey, protesters chanted, "Kill the bill, don't kill me." Similar protests targeted Senators Tom Cotton of Arkansas, Marco Rubio of Florida, Rob Portman of Ohio, and Cory Gardner of Colorado. Meanwhile, constituents of Senator Lisa Murkowski flooded the Alaska senator's office, urging her to vote no on the Republican health care bill. They were met by Murkowski's aide, Kevin Sweeney.
Senator Murkowski is a very deliberate senator. Senator Murkowski, and she's shown this in the past. She's shown this in the past that she wants to do what's right for Alaska, but she needs to know exactly what it is that she's doing. She wants to know what the impact this is going to be on Alaskans.
It's going to kill people. It's not hard to figure out.
22 million Americans from their insurance.
This bill already has actuarial tables attached to it, as obviously drafts, that show the only way these numbers come about through the CBO is if people die early.
During Wednesday's protests, police arrested 40 people on misdemeanor charges of unlawful crowding, obstructing, or incommoding. President Trump's ban on refugees and travelers from 6 Muslim-majority countries will partially take effect this evening after the Supreme Court said it'll examine the constitutionality of the order. The ruling will affect some travelers from Libya, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, foreign nationals from those countries who can't show a credible claim of a bona fide relationship with a person or entity in the United States will be barred from entering the country. The ban is set to last for 90 days, meaning it'll expire ahead of an expected ruling from the Supreme Court in October. In Afghanistan, leaders of NATO say the military alliance will send more troops to work with U.S.-backed Afghan security forces, extending the longest war in U.S. history. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Thursday 15 nations will contribute to the increase, though he did not say how many additional troops NATO members would send. U.S. military leaders have asked for an additional 3,000 to 5,000 troops after President Trump gave the Pentagon authority to set troop levels. Back on Capitol Hill, anti-torture protesters interrupted a Senate panel Wednesday as it heard testimony from the Trump administration's pick to become the Transportation Department's top lawyer. The protest came during a confirmation hearing for Stephen Bradbury, who formerly served in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. In 2005, Bradbury authored memos justifying the Bush administration's use of torture in interrogations. This is Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth questioning Bradbury.
You are an architect of the legal justification for detainee abuse in the form of waterboarding and other forms of torture. In my opinion, that alone should disqualify you for future government service. And while you're nominated to serve at DOT and not at Justice, your willingness to aid and abet torture demonstrates a failure of moral and professional character that makes you dangerous regardless of which agency you serve in.
Stephen Bradbury's confirmation hearing came as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights blasted what he called President Trump's persistent flirtation with torture. Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein said, quote, "The President of the United States of America has said torture could be necessary in certain circumstances. There's no longer any pretense. They're breaking long-held taboos. The dangers to the entire system of international law are therefore very real," he said. In media news, 3 reporters with CNN resigned this week after their network retracted a report alleging a senior Trump advisor is under investigation by Congress. CNN's story cited a single anonymous source who alleged the Senate Intelligence Committee was investigating whether the advisor, Anthony Scaramucci, met with the chief executive of a Russian investment fund ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration and whether the pair discussed U.S. sanctions against Russia. The retraction prompted a Twitter rant from President Trump, who tweeted, "So they caught fake news, CNN cold, but what about NBC, CBS, and ABC? What about the failing New York Times and Washington Post? They're all fake news." Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports the Trump Organization publicly posted framed copies of a fake Time magazine cover lauding Donald Trump at least 5 Trump properties. The phony Time cover features a portrait of Trump next to the headlines, "The Apprentice is a television smash," and "Trump is hitting on all fronts, even TV." Time magazine has asked the president to remove these fake Time covers from his properties. The head of the Environmental Protection Agency met privately with Dow Chemicals CEO ahead of an EPA decision to allow the use of a pesticide that sickened farm workers and is known to cause brain damage in children. The Associated Press reports EPA Chief Scott Pruitt met for about half an hour with Dow CEO Andrew Liveris at the hotel in Houston, Texas on March 9th. 20 days later, Pruitt's agency unexpectedly reversed course and approved use of the pesticide, which is manufactured by Dow. Meanwhile, the EPA has announced new plans to roll back an Obama administration policy that environmentalists say will remove drinking water safeguards for 1 in 3 Americans and threaten wetlands and thousands of streams that flow into larger rivers and lakes. The 2015 regulation determined more than half the country's waterways are covered under the Clean Water Act. In a statement Tuesday, EPA Chief Scott Pruitt announced plans to rescind the rule and launch a review of which water bodies will fall under federal protection. Meanwhile, The Intercept reports the person Trump has appointed to head the EPA agency in charge of water safety is a former lobbyist with deep ties to a fossil fuel advocacy group that promotes the Dakota Access Pipeline and controversial offshore drilling efforts. Dennis Lee Forsgren will help oversee the EPA's Office of Water, which implements the landmark Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water Acts that were passed in the early 70s. This includes studying the toxic effects of fracking on groundwater safety, the downstream consequences of industrial pollutants, and the environmental impact of oil spills. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. In Libya, rescue workers recovered the bodies of 5 migrants Wednesday who drowned in the Mediterranean as they attempted the perilous journey to Europe. The bodies were found as Libya's Coast Guard said it picked up some 5,000 migrants at sea. Meanwhile, the Italian Navy brought hundreds of migrants ashore after including an infant who died of heat-related causes shortly after he and his mother were rescued. The International Organization for Migration said some 11,000 migrants have been pulled from unsafe and overcrowded boats this week alone. In Mexico City, journalists and their supporters rallied Wednesday outside the National Palace to call on the government to take action to end a spate of attacks on media workers. The protests came as the Committee to Protect Journalists said Mexico is the world's deadliest country for reporters so far in 2017. This is Mexican investigative reporter Alvaro Delgado.
There is a serious crisis of violence against journalists that is not new, but has deepened in recent years. It is in the context of the violence that exists in the country, but to a large extent, the crisis has worsened by the disdainful and often complicit conduct by the government of Mexico.
The protests came after the body of journalist Salvador Adame was discovered in the state of Michoacan more than a month after he was kidnapped. Adame is at least the 7th journalist to be killed in Mexico this year. Back in the United States, a court in Georgia has set an October 23rd court date for U.S. intelligence contractor Reality Lee Winner, who's pleaded not guilty on charges of leaking a top-secret document claiming Russian military intelligence conducted a cyber attack on at least one U.S. voting software company just days before last November's election. Winner has been denied bail and is still being held in jail in Lincoln County, Georgia. In Minnesota, the city of St. Anthony will pay nearly $3 million to the family of Philando Castile to settle a wrongful death lawsuit less than 2 weeks after Officer Geronimo Yanez was acquitted on manslaughter charges for killing Castile during a traffic stop last year. A family lawyer said the settlement will help benefit the Philando Castile Relief Foundation, set up to help victims of gun violence and to provide relief for the grieving. The settlement follows a similar deal struck last week in Ferguson, Missouri, between the city of Ferguson and the parents of Michael Brown over the killing of their son by white police officer Darren Wilson in 2014. In the Netherlands, the widows of 9 men who were hanged by Nigeria's military government in 1995 have filed suit against Shell Oil in a Dutch court, charging the company with complicity in the deaths. Among those hanged was Ken Saro-Wiwa, who led the movement against Shell's oil practices in the Ogoni region of Nigeria. Despite widespread international protests, Saro-Wiwa was hanged under the Nigerian dictatorship after a sham trial, along with 8 other Ogoni rights activists. And in Little Rock, Arkansas, a driver plowed into a monument to the 10 Commandments Wednesday, destroying the religious display less than a day after state officials erected it on the grounds of the state capitol. A video posted to Facebook showed the moment the monument was destroyed.
Oh my goodness. Freedom!
The driver, Michael T. Reed, was arrested on felony charges. Reed is accused of a similar act in 2014 that destroyed a public monument to the 10 Commandments in Oklahoma. Arkansas officials have vowed to rebuild their state's monument, even though the American Civil Liberties Union has promised to challenge the display as a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. As Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell attempts to revive a bill to overturn Obamacare, we look today at the radical right's attempt to reshape the role of the federal government, from health care to education to housing. While the Congressional Budget Office predicts 22 million would lose health insurance as a result of the Senate bill, some forces in the Republican Party, including the billionaire Koch brothers, say the bill does not go far enough. This comes as the Koch brothers recently announced plans to spend between $300 and $400 million in the 2018 midterm elections. During a retreat last week, Charles Koch said, quote, "We are more optimistic now about what we can accomplish than we have ever been."
Well, as the Koch brothers gear up for the 2018 elections, we turn now to look at the ideological roots that have reshaped the Republican Party in recent decades. A new book by the historian Nancy MacLean uncovers the instrumental role the late libertarian economist James Buchanan played in the right's campaign to eliminate unions, suppress voting, privatize schools, and curb Democratic majority rule. Her book is titled Democracy in Chains: The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. MacLean is a professor of history and public policy at Duke University. Nancy MacLean, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
I'm so pleased to be with you.
Let's start with today's headline, the health care bill. Deeply unpopular. Let's just look quickly at the polls across the board. You have the Quinnipiac poll that says 16% of people in this country approve the Republican plan. You've got the USA Today poll, only 12%. You've got NPR, PBS, Marist poll, 17%. And yet, the Republicans are attempting to revive it and push it through once again. In your book, Democracy in Chains, you lay out the deep history of the radical right's stealth plan for America. Talk about this as an example of what you have found.
Yes, I had never encountered James Buchanan before I started the research that ultimately became this book. But what I learned in the course of that research is that this economist, who was trained at the University of Chicago, who was part of the same milieu as Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and so forth, he went a distinctive way. And he used the economic tools he got at the University of Chicago to look at politics in a new way. And he produced ultimately the kind of pernicious cynicism that we see all around us today, and that Donald Trump's candidacy and rhetoric embodies. And in the healthcare debate, what we see is that Buchanan gave the advice to others on the right and to his corporate funders and donors and the people that he talked to that for capitalism of the kind they wanted to thrive, democracy must be enchained. Democracy must be, in effect, shackled to prevent the majority will from being expressed, because it would take too much from people of great wealth, and that would be a problem for them. And so we see this being played out in the healthcare debate now, in which, as you quoted in those polls, most people are horrified by this Republican proposal. They don't want it. They understand that people will die from it. They understand that people who have cancer will be paying astronomical rates for their health care if this thing goes through. They understand what a total disaster it is. And yet one of our major political parties has become captive to these donor interests, using the strategy that comes from Buchanan of changing the incentives and the rules, and they are beholden to those donor networks. What I think is fascinating is that our democracy is still working. And so some Senate Republicans are wavering because they are actually listening to their constituents and their voters, and they're getting tons of calls from their constituents and their voters, and they're defying the Kochs.
But those were Buchanan's ideas, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Right. But talk about his relationship to, well, a key player in all of this are the Koch brothers. They just held a retreat. Talk about specifically what their relationship is, as they say they're going to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the elections coming up.
Yes, and I should say it's a very interesting end story, because the Kochs actually pushed James Buchanan aside when he began to raise some questions about the way they were operating at George Mason University. So he was not as involved in the rollout. It's really his ideas and his insights that they are applying, but they did not treat him very well at the end. So
How did they know each other?
They came to know each other from Buchanan's book on campus unrest in 1969, which Koch's Center for Independent Education reprinted to get to more people. It's basically the kind of manual that is transforming public higher education right now. So they got to know each other then. Charles Koch joined something called the Mont Pelerin Society, which many of your listeners will be familiar with, in 1970, and actually advertised for all of his functions and his organizations and his talent pipelines and his recruitment efforts in Mont Pelerin Society materials.
Mont Pelerin is?
I'm so sorry. Mont Pelerin is an international invitation-only society by what some people would call free market fundamentalists that was launched in 1947 and has spread to the entire world now. It's invitation-only. It includes arch-right economists, corporate officials, many leading operatives of the Koch-funded network are part of the Mont Pelerin Society now. So it's a very significant body. And in fact, it was at Mont Pelerin Society meetings that many of these ideas were discussed and strategies were developed to implement, from what I've been able to pick up from the documentary trail. But Koch and Buchanan began to cooperate, particularly in the 1970s, as Koch was launching what became the Charles Koch, the Cato Institute. It started as the Charles Koch Foundation, and got to know each other over the years. Buchanan also advised the Chilean dictatorship on a constitution that would enable them to make a transition back to elected government while keeping the radical, unpopular changes that they'd made in place. And so in the 1980s, in the wake of that Chilean experience, Buchanan also began to advise Charles Koch's Cato Institute on a strategy for Social Security privatization, which again would be starting from the recognition that what they wanted was not popular with any constituency in America. And Buchanan laid it out. He said, people, not the old, the young, the black, the white, men, women, there was even another category. Nobody wants to see Social Security changed in the way that these guys wanted to change it. And so he laid out a step-by-step strategy for how to do that, how to spread misinformation, how to break up existing coalitions, how to pick off existing Social Security recipients so that they wouldn't be in the fight because they'd be the most motivated. It's really quite breathtaking stuff. And it's the kind of strategic thinking that is now informing the entire Koch apparatus in our country. So, yeah, really, really serious stuff. And I think, we've had such brilliant journalism about the money trail on all of this and the dark money. But to really understand what's going on, I think we need to understand the ideas that are guiding this and what the end game is. And I think once people understand those ideas and that end game and how totally hostile it is to democracy as we have known it over the 20th, since 1900, I think that they will really understand the scale of the threat that we're faced with.
Well, Buchanan was from the South.
Yes.
Now, can you, unlike other Chicago school economists, so can you explain how that was relevant to the ideas that he came up with, and also the extent to which he transformed, his ideas were able to transform the Republican Party?
Yes. To make a long story short, he was born in Tennessee, raised in the South, actually had a fellowship that required him to go back and teach in a Southern public institution after he completed his degree. And he specialized in public finance, which was very important to many governors and state legislatures, but in the South, there was a very draconian approach to public finance. So he fit in well when he came home. He believed that there should never be, that there should be no deficits of any kind, no deficit spending. Very parsimonious approach to public spending of all kinds. And he arrived in Virginia in 1956, just as that state was leading the South in a fight against Brown versus Board of Education. I want to be clear, I have no evidence of Buchanan saying anything about race directly in his fight against Brown versus Board of Education, but what he did using his Chicago economics training is make a case for arch privatization of all Virginia public education. And we didn't even have the verb privatize or the noun privatization then, but that's essentially what he advocated, and that was the demand of the most arch segregationists. The leaders of massive resistance wanted that, and in the end, Buchanan's proposal was too radical. Just like today with the health care, Buchanan's proposal was too radical for even the most right-wing Virginia, for the Virginia legislature, and so it was defeated, and it was in the wake of that defeat defeat that he began to develop this new way of thinking about politics as the state of Virginia finally became open to the majority of its citizens. And I should add there, white as well as black. Virginia practiced voter suppression to an extraordinary degree, such that some said that next to Virginia, Mississippi was a hotbed of democracy.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guest is Nancy McLean. She's author of the new book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. She's professor of history and public policy at Duke University in North Carolina. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with her in a minute.
The moment you tie your own shoes, or spelled your name in your alphabet soup, or told your mom that you're walking to the bus stop by yourself. Don't talk to strangers. The moment you fell on the schoolyard, or scraped your knee falling into his arms, you knew from the start that you're walking and you gotta do it by yourself. It's the rhythm of life. When you're humming and singing all the words that you don't know, it's the rhythm of life. When you're grabbing and touching and loving who you don't know. The moment you got your first car, the places it took you, tell me how far you were when you ran out of gas and wanted to go to the store. It's called being lost and being found. When highways of life take you all around, experience shows you the wrong way, so you never have to go around. It's the rhythm of life. When you're humming and singing all the words that you don't know, it's the rhythm of life. When you're grabbing and touching and loving.
Rhythm of Life by Tank and the Bangas. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We're speaking with Nancy McLean, author of the new book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. She's a professor of history and public policy at Duke University. I'd like to get your response to an excerpt from the BBC TV documentary series directed by Adam Curtis. The documentary is called The Trap: What Happened to Our Dream of Freedom. In this clip, James Buchanan, whom you profile in your book, explains why he believes there is no such thing as the public interest.
There's certainly no measurable concept that's meaningful that could be called the public interest, because how do you weigh different interests of different groups and what they can get out of it? The public interest, as a politician thinks it, does not mean it exists. It's what he thinks is good for the country. If he would come out and say that, that's one thing. But behind this hypocrisy of calling something the public interest as if it exists, that's what I was trying to tear down.
So that was economist James Buchanan in the BBC TV series directed by Adam Curtis. So, Nancy, could you tell us, first of all, respond to what he says about the public interest? And also, you say that Trump is almost the logical conclusion of some of Buchanan's ideas. So could you explain what you mean by that and what ideas specifically?
Yeah, I actually have never seen the clip that you just pulled, so I just want to underscore for listeners those words. That's what I wanted to tear down, the idea of a public interest. You know, when we try to understand the mayhem that's unfolding all around us, the ugliness that's out there, the gross, you know, aspersions on people's character who are trying to help people in our society, right, and make a better country. That's where this comes from. So that was Buchanan's idea, yes, is that we're all just self-interested actors and nobody's telling the truth. So I'm sorry, I forgot the follow-up.
Well, about what the connection is
with Trump,
between,
of course. So, I mean, if you listen to any of Trump's rhetoric on the campaign trail, he is speaking that language of tearing down the notion of the public interest, of, you know, slandering any of his critics, of making anybody who is, you know, from the opposition party look, you know, crooked Hillary. All that kind of language comes from this Buchanan notion that our modern politics is essentially a system of corruption that transfers refers from some people to others, and this language of makers and takers that we have is very much Buchananite. So he actually portrayed citizens. He talked about coalitions of exploitation. So, for example, if you had, say, home health care workers who were working with public health professionals who were trying to expand the amount of monies for Medicaid, for child's health care, he would see that as exploiting wealthy taxpayers. And this is the language that the Republican Party has picked up and channeled from the radical right. It's a language, and he used these words, predators and prey. It's a predatory system. So this is antithetical not just to 20th century democracy, this is antithetical to the ideas on which this country was founded. The idea that there's something called we the people, and that together through deliberation we can make a more perfect union.
This is a clip of an interview with White House strategist Steve Bannon at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC.
I think if you look at the lines of work, I kind of break it out into three verticals or three buckets. The first is kind of national security and sovereignty, and that's your intelligence, the Defense Department, Homeland Security. The second line of work is what I refer to as economic nationalism. The third, broadly, line of work is what is deconstruction of the administrative state. If you look at these cabinet appointees, they were selected for a reason, and that is the deconstruction. The way the progressive left runs is if they can't get it passed, they're just going to put it in some sort of regulation in an agency. That's all going to be deconstructed, and I think that that's why this regulatory thing is so important.
We had Dr.
That was Steve Bannon speaking at CPAC, talking about the deconstruction of the administrative state. And as the media focuses on just a particular series of issues in Washington, whether it's the health care plan or the Russia investigation, in fact, there is a very systematic, very fast dismantling of the administrative state that is going on. And I was wondering if you could comment on that and some of the people who are involved with this, from Scott Pruitt to Mick Mulvaney, the OMB director, even to the White House counsel, Don McGahn.
Yes, thank you. This notion that Bannon represents something very different from the Kochs is troubling, because it leads us to not notice exactly what your clip just showed, that he is utterly devoted to deconstructing the administrative state. This also comes from Buchananite thinking, which said that agency officials don't, and this includes public health professionals too. This apparatus has tried to discredit people who test children's blood for lead. I mean, this is how bad it is. But they will say that agency officials only want to expand their fiefdoms. They don't actually care about the issues they're working on. They just want their own self-aggrandizement. And so Bannon is expressing this and talking about the deconstruction of the administrative state, and they are doing it, as you pointed out, Amy, in your opening news segments, about all the environmental regulations they're undoing, all kinds of other regulations they're undoing. As we all focus on Trump's tweets, they are undermining core features of our democracy and of our regulatory system on which we all depend for our health, our well-being, our clean water, our clean air, and the quality of our public health apparatus. And we can see this in the Republican Party being captured by this donor network because they vote against things like funding for Zika and Ebola, and they don't believe in public health. They don't, they just come from a different philosophical system.
So how did you find out about the Nobel Prize-winning economist Buchanan and his close ties to the Koch brothers, particularly Charles Koch?
I did not set out looking for this man. This man announced himself to me from the archives. I had just finished a book on something else when I happened on the story of the school closures in Prince Edward County from 1959 to 1964 in protest against Brown versus Board of Education, and in the name of individual liberty and states' rights. A county in Virginia completely shut down its public school system and sent all the white children off to private schools and deprived black children of education, any formal education, for 5 years. And it was part of the system of mass resistance that came with the first modern system of tuition grants, they called it, but it was essentially school vouchers. And I became intrigued about this. And then I learned that Milton Friedman had written his first modern case for vouchers in 1955, as news came up that the most arch segregationists were saying they were going to completely shut down public education rather than desegregate. So I thought, what are these various people who talk about a free society and who talk about liberty doing, essentially abetting the most arch segregationists who are trying to destroy public education in order to preserve segregation. So at first I was following Friedman, but Buchanan kept appearing with different reports, pushing for the most arch privatization. And then, so I followed those reports. He came on my radar. Then I learned that his impact on Chile was more lasting than Milton Friedman's because he advised the Chilean constitution that made it so that when there was a transition back to elected government, only super majorities of people would be able to affect change. So essentially, he helped shackle democracy in Chile in ways they're still wrestling with.
And this shored up Pinochet.
Yes, it was 1980. You know, I have a whole chapter about it. It's a really chilling story. But so then I saw him. That was my second data point. My third data point was moving to North Carolina in 2010 and then seeing the radical Republican takeover of my state government. And what they were doing, I realized, was a concrete incarnation of what Buchanan had written about. And that included things from the most draconian unemployment insurance changes that we'd seen in the country, later a monster voter suppression bill, some of the most arch gerrymandering in the country, undermining public education, shifting resources to totally unaccountable private education providers. I mean, just the list goes on. And I mean, I could tell you 30 things if we had time that they did in North Carolina, but that helped me to see what was going on. And also the person who's crucial in North Carolina, as the journalist Jane Mayer pointed out, Art Pope, has been working with the Kochs for several decades now. And he actually used the phrase, his organization used the phrase Big Bang to describe what they were doing. And that's a phrase that actually comes out of the George Mason operation that Koch funded by someone that Charles Koch has worked with there for several years, urged that if you want to push through this agenda that most people do not want and would not support if they knew it was coming, you should have a big bang. He said you should have clustered big bangs, and that's what we've seen all around the country.
Explain. Clustered big bangs.
Yeah, that was his phrase.
Meaning?
Oh, meaning that you push things through very radically, a whole series of things. It's like the shock and awe doctrine of warfare, right? That you push out so much so quickly that people are utterly shocked. You know, they just don't even know where to start to resist, and they can't respond to the whole panoply of measures. And while they're shocked and dazed, you've effectively changed the terrain.
So let's turn to Reverend Dr. William Barber. You're talking about North Carolina, president of the North Carolina NAACP, one of the state's leading progressive voices. We've spoken to him over the years. This is back in 2012 when he talked about the role of Art Pope in North Carolina state politics.
Brothers and some of the leaders of a group called Civitas are highly connected to the Tea Party elements and the Koch brother money.
And the Koch brothers are the billionaire funders.
Yeah, billionaire funder, and we call Art Pope in our state a little Koch brother. You know, he's connected to that whole funding. Yes, he is.
He is who?
Art Pope, who runs Civitas Funds. He funds all these ultra-conservative groups. Has spent something like $40 million of his own money to try to take over the state legislature, and they're the ones that have pushed all of this regressive voting rights and the Amendment 1. But it was
Amendment 1
on same-sex marriage. But we clearly know what's up. The reality is, they could not handle this diverse electorate that has now been produced by this progressive voting laws that we have in a southern state. And so, Amy, what we saw in this, instead of dealing with the issue of poverty, instead of dealing with the issue of jobs, we lost 300,000 jobs because of the bad policies of the last administration during the Bush era. But instead of dealing with that, what did they do? They attacked voting rights, tried to pass voter ID.
So that was Reverend William Barber back in 2012. We were speaking actually there at the Democratic Convention that was taking place. Reverend Barber has gone on to lead the Moral Mondays movement, become a major figure in civil rights and human rights in this country, head of the North Carolina NAACP and head of Repairers of the Breach. But this also goes to the resistance. And you mentioned earlier about the book Campus Unrest that James Buchanan authored back in the 1960s. If you can talk about what he proposes as the strategies to deal not only with campus unrest, but with the kind of resistance that we're seeing even today, though in fact he's not around anymore, Buchanan.
So in the book, it was called Academia in Anarchy, and he proposed full tuition, no more state accessible state public higher education. You should pay full price tuition or not be there, because otherwise you would have a perverse incentive to organize and do other things than studying. He basically wanted to do away with faculty governance. He wanted to have donors and state legislatures exercise control over public institutions of higher education. And we're seeing this happen in public institutions in red-controlled states around the country. There's a brilliant documentary called Starving the Beast about this that I urge people to watch. It's very widely available. So that's the education piece. Now, the other piece that Buchanan's ideas are informing is this state strategy. And so we have talked about the federal, but I think listeners need to be aware that much of this is being rolled out at the state level. And I think the state level is key, because they already fully control, they have what's called trifecta control, both houses of the legislature and the governorship in 25 states. Democrats only have that in 6 states. And in those 25 states, they're effectively building up a kind of tourniquet over progressive policy nationally to push the agenda. This has been advocated by Buchanan. He convened corporate audiences and talked about policies on the spectrum of succession, he said, including privatization, decentralization, devolution, and a few more things. But basically the idea was that you could use states to whipsaw one another in the ways that we've seen, that we call the race for the bottom, not knowing that this was intentional strategy. So there's that. But the ultimate big bang of this project is that they want to change our Constitution. And they are actually building towards a constitutional convention. So they have 28 states that have called for this constitutional convention. They need 6 more. And speaking to your point about resistance, the way that they plan to get those 6 more is by doing these things like these very aggressive right-to-work laws to undermine unions, because unions have been a significant defenders of democracy for all of us, attacking public education, because public school teachers have been important forces for democracy and defending democracy for all of us. The gerrymandering, the voter suppression, all those efforts are designed to suppress the popular voice, because these people know that if majorities understood what these guys have in mind for them, they would resist, they would oppose, and they would try to stop it, as they are doing with the health care, where they can see that it's concrete, they can see the reality. This means people will die. People are responding to that, and they want to stop that resistance, and that's why they're doing the things they do. And can I say the single most important thing of my book that I hope people will take away is the number of times these people talk about what they're doing in the clear knowledge that they are a minority movement and that they can never persuade the majority, and that's why they're operating in the way that they are.
And could you speak specifically about what Buchanan, his take on social movements, and why it was important to block social movements?
Yeah, he didn't actually write about social, he talked much more about groups, and he would call everybody special interest, because the very idea of a social movement like him is like the public interest, right? It couldn't possibly exist because we're just aggregations of individuals doing our self-seeking. But he very clearly understood that the labor movement that was built up in the 1930s, the CIO, which was a very progressive force in all public life, for public transparency, for employment security, old age security, just all these things. The CIO was a very progressive force, and it deeply alarmed the Southern elite with whom Buchanan was allied. So the CIO was the first thing. The civil rights movement was another. Many of us think about the civil rights movement in terms of fighting attitudinal racism, but Buchanan was a specialist in public finance. Buchanan understood that if the civil rights movement succeeded, and if African Americans were able to vote and change public policy, it would be costly, because people who have been held in poverty, whose schools were terrible, who were denied public health, are going to want changes, and they're going to vote for those changes and elect people who will bring them.
So that goes to the central issue of voter suppression. When you say they recognize they would always be a minority, so then you have to suppress the will of the majority.
Absolutely. And also, let me add, too, that gerrymandering was a well-established practice in the South that was being threatened at the time Buchanan was writing. So the Virginia state legislature grossly vastly overrepresented rural conservative districts and underrepresented not only cities but also the suburbs, where there were more moderate white Republicans. And one historian who has looked at this pointed out that if the cities and suburbs had been able to vote in proportion to their numbers, massive resistance would not have passed. They would not have shut down schools because so many people didn't want it. So all the things that we're seeing now, we can trace back to then. And so, you know, my question for America is, do we want to live in a cosmetically updated version of 1950s Virginia, or do we want to keep making the kind of progress toward an inclusive democracy that we had been making in the past few decades?
And talk about the idea of libertarianism. I mean, it's very popular now amongst young people. What was Buchanan's relationship to, what did he think of libertarianism? Did he ever articulate a position, what it meant for him?
Yes, he spoke of freedom as being the highest value. And he said, I don't want to control you, and I don't want to be controlled by you. And that sounds really nice. I mean, we all probably feel like that, right? I mean, who wants to be controlled by somebody else? But what he was getting at in that is that the control that libertarians want to resist, at least the architects of the strategy we're looking at, not necessarily the teenagers who, you know, who like the anti-empire kind of politics, they don't want to be controlled by democracy, right? They just want to do their own thing, and that's particularly true for economic liberty. So from what I've been able to learn in studying this movement over the years, following its intellectuals, following its operations, whatever they say about liberty, ultimately it really comes down to economic liberty. And they're very happy to sacrifice political liberty or civil liberties in order to protect that economic liberty. There's a beautiful poem by Langston Hughes, which I should be carrying in my back pocket, and I haven't, but I will after this because I'm embarrassed not to have it. But in that poem, Langston Hughes talks about the difference between liberty and freedom, and basically talks about liberty as a source of nightmares, because liberty is the idea of the slaveholders and the John C. Calhouns and so forth that was used to keep African Americans down for so long, whereas he talks about freedom as a beautiful thing. And so I think what's really important for progressives now and people who oppose this Koch apparatus, I think we have to take back that language of freedom, because we, you know, the civil rights movement, what was SNCC's slogan was freedom now. Right? We are the people who want people to have the freedom to live their lives autonomously, to do what they need to do, but we understand we need to do that together in collaboration. And the people we're up against will suppress all of our freedoms to get their economic liberty.
In fact, David Koch in 1980 ran as the Libertarian Party's vice presidential candidate.
Yes.
Well, finally, as you link James Buchanan and your research on this, on the late Nobel Prize-winning economists, to what we are seeing today in the Trump administration. And let's be clear, the Koch brothers are opposed to the current Republican health care bill because it doesn't go far enough.
Yes. Yes. Well, I do want to say, too, that Buchanan was not around for the final rollout of this. And as I said at the outset, he actually, I think, was a little appalled at what was being done in his name. For example, as soon as the Kochs moved into George Mason, they moved.
George Mason University.
George Mason University, right outside D.C., very convenient to exercise control in Washington. As soon as the Kochs moved in and made their first big $10 million commitment in 1997, they moved in all these operatives. All these operatives started, claiming titles for themselves, president of this, blah, 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 blah. But they also started violating nonprofit tax law, according to at least one whistleblower. And Wendy Graham, who was the wife of a sitting senator, Phil Graham, was sending out very partisan letters, fundraising letters for the Buchanan Center, saying how it was going to change our politics. And I think that's very interesting. And I personally know that Buchanan was sickened by that. So Buchanan actually pulls away from this as it takes off. But Koch is so well funded. I mean, we would not be here without Buchanan's ideas and Koch's money. And the money that Koch has pulled together from these donors, they are pushing this system through in a way that I actually believe might have appalled Buchanan, too, because it's such grotesque use of the political system and of the corruption of money in politics in order to get what they want.
Well, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Nancy McLean, author of Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, professor of history and public policy at Duke University. When we come back, the EPA's new water safety official is a lobbyist with deep ties to the Dakota Access Pipeline. We'll talk about that with the Intercept investigative reporter Lee Fong. Stay with us. Hold tight by Sinkane here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to the latest move by the Trump administration to undo President Obama's environmental legacy. Trump has already withdrawn the United States from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, rescinded the Clean Power Plan, reversed a moratorium on leasing federal lands for coal mining, and proposed deep cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency. On Tuesday, the EPA announced new plans to roll back an Obama administration policy that environmentalists say will remove drinking water safeguards for 1 in 3 Americans and threaten thousands of streams that flow into large rivers and lakes, as well as wetland areas that filter pollutants and absorb floodwaters. The 2015 regulation, known as Waters of the United States, determined that more than half of the country's waterways are covered under the Clean Water Act.
Now The Intercept has revealed the person that President Trump has tapped to head the EPA agency in charge of water safety is a former lobbyist with deep ties to a fossil fuel advocacy group that promotes the Dakota Access Pipeline and offshore drilling. Dennis Lee Forsgren will help oversee the EPA's Office of Water, which implements the landmark Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water Act that were passed in the early 70s. This includes studying the toxic effects of fracking on groundwater safety, the downstream consequences of industrial pollutants, and the environmental impacts of oil spills. For more, we go to San Francisco. We're joined by Lee Fong, investigative journalist at The Intercept, covering the intersection of money and politics. His latest piece, EPA's new water safety official, is a lobbyist with deep ties to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Lee, welcome back to Democracy Now! Tell us what you found.
Amy, Nermeen, thank you so much for having me. The latest political appointee in the Trump administration, as you mentioned, is Dennis Lee Forsgren. This is an individual who's been appointed to head up the department within the EPA that deals with safe drinking water and, reviewing research into water safety. And this is a potentially problematic political appointee because this person comes directly from a fossil fuel lobbying firm, HBW Resources, that is kind of infamous for cloak and dagger tactics. They were very prominent in the fight over the Keystone XL pipeline and more recently on the Dakota Access Pipeline.
So who are Lee Fong? Just tell us a little bit more about HBW Resources and who their clients have been.
Well, we've tracked HBW for a while now, and this is a lobbying firm that actually specializes in kind of deceptive tactics, and I'll just give you 3 examples of that. They operate a kind of fake consumer group. This is the Consumer Energy Alliance, purportedly an organization that represents mom-and-pop energy users, but in fact, this is an organization fully controlled by these fossil fuel lobbyists, funded by large oil and gas companies, oil refineries, that goes out and kind of misrepresents itself to influence the public debate, around these oil and gas issues. Another example is the fight over Arctic drilling. You know, when Shell Oil was pushing to drill in a very sensitive area of the environment near Alaska, there was a letter writing campaign to kind of convince regulators to give them approval. And HBW and CEA helped facilitate a lot of these letters. One of these letters supposedly came from an onion farmer group, but we looked at these letters and they were essentially copy and pasted from language provided by these lobbyists. So it didn't seem like a truly authentic letter. They kind of specialize in these type of astroturf or fake grassroots strategies. And on the Dakota Access Pipeline, you know, these same lobbyists were involved in, you know, setting up events and going up to Standing Rock and being quoted in the media. They attacked the protesters at Standing Rock, claiming that, you know, the protesters who went to demonstrate against the pipeline, they weren't interested in protecting the environment, that the people involved in these protests were simply going up there to slow down the American economy. And, you know, if you've talked to any of these protesters, that's clearly not true, but that's kind of part and parcel to the tactics used by this lobbying firm.
Well, I want to read a statement by Consumer Energy Alliance President David Holt in October 2016 during the protest by waterkeepers against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Holt stated, quote, "The steps taken by these individuals to sabotage pipelines, in addition to the threats, intimidation, and cyberbullying tactics they're using, clearly show that their agenda has nothing to do with protecting the environment and everything to do with shutting down the American economy and hurting everyday Americans, families, small business, and our economic way of life." Lee Fong, can you respond to that and also explain who the funders are for the CEA, the Consumer Energy Alliance?
Right. Well, you know, the CEA group, you know, they pretend to be an independent organization, but, you know, we've gone through tax filings and found that, you know, large oil refineries, companies like Koch Industries that you previously referenced on your show, and Phillips 66, these big kind of industrial polluters are providing a significant portion of the financing for CEA. And, you know, the quote that you just read is kind of a typical strategy. That they place advertisements, they write letters to the editor, they hold rallies, and kind of organize opposition to actual social movements and to grassroots groups. And the individual that provided that quote you just read, you know, he says that he's you know, a voice of the consumer, but actually he's just another person at the same lobbying firm where Dennis Lee Forsgren is from. So, you know, they control this fake consumer group. They go out and they use these kind of aggressive tactics to diminish the work of social movements.
You know, earlier this week, the EPA taking steps to rescind the Waters of the United States rule. Explain what the administration is trying to do and how it links into the current man that the Trump has tapped, Forsgren.
Well, the Waters of the United States rule is a major achievement by the Obama administration. It extends Clean Water Act protections. You know, this law originally applied only to large bodies of water like the Chesapeake Bay, but the regulation in 2015 extended these protections to wetlands and streams, bodies of water that feed into larger bodies like the Chesapeake Bay. And this has been bitterly opposed by lobbyists. You see big agribusiness and industrial polluters lobbying very aggressively against this rule. You know, back when there was the debt ceiling fight, the government shutdown fight, lobbyists attempted to attach budget riders to repeal this rule, and they were unsuccessful. But now with the Trump administration, they have another opportunity to repeal this regulation, and that's exactly the process that began this week. The Office of Water and the EPA will be managing that process. And, you know, the EPA under the Trump administration is a perfect example of industry capture. From the top of the administration down, we've seen political appointees directly from industry. You know, the Legal Affairs Office is now staffed by Trump administration appointees from the utility industry. We see a coal lobbyist as the #2 appointee. Just this week, we saw another oil and gas lobbyist from the American Petroleum Institute appointed to another legal affairs office of the EPA. So as the EPA moves to repeal these environmental safeguards, you literally have oil and gas lobbyists who've spent the last 3 to 4 years fighting this regulation, now in charge of repealing it.
Does Forsgren have to go through congressional approval, Lei-Fang?
No, and that's kind of an interesting dynamic here.
We have 5 seconds.
No, he does not. He's a deputy administrator, and the EPA has been pushing through a lot of deputy roles that do not require Senate confirmation.
We'll leave it there, but we're going to interview you about other issues and post it at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nirmeet Sheikh.